Welcome to the Occult Rejects. Today, we're going to be talking about a little bit more of Rosicrucianism. I think you guys already know we do love talking about that a lot. And today, we are joined by Ronnie Pontiac. He's an independent scholar whose work bridges archival research with contemporary esoteric studies. From 1980 to 1987, he served as a research assistant, screener, and substitute lecturer from Manly P. Hall at the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles. Ronnie is the author of American Metaphysical Religion, a 600-page survey that maps 4 centuries of occult, mystical, and alternative spiritual currents in the United States. His forthcoming study, The Rosicrucian Counterculture, The Origins and Influence of the Invisible Society, tracks the Rosicrucian manifestos from their 17th century publication in German lands to their surprising afterlives in science, art, and modern protest movements, showing how the Brotherhood's counterculture ideals still resonate today. Yeah, I think that was enough. Yeah, that's who we got going on for us today. Very excited to have him on. But before we get to Ronnie, let me introduce the other rejects joining us. Today, I got the occult reject mad scientist, Lisa, with us. What is going on?
Hi, Nick. I am very excited. I'm extremely excited to have Ronnie on. A lot because just looking at his work is extremely impressive. Who he's worked for, extremely impressive. And if you've been listening to some of the episodes, every time we look into an occultist or a mystic, they all kind of coalesce or point towards this Rosicrucian thing. And then from last night's episode, German occultism, yeah, I'm super excited about this. And the only thing I need to plug is occultresearchinstitute.org. Some of the other occult rejects have contributed to the website. If you like to consume your content in literary form, check us out at occultresearchinstitute.org. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Lisa. And yeah, for sure. I mean, we've covered so many people that they're considered, apologists, or they're blamed for being a Rosicrucian, or whatever. Definitely comes up a lot, and I was excited when I came across this man. And now, Robby Marx, sir, the storyteller. What is going on?
Yeah, I'm R. Marx, and yeah, I as well am excited about this to hear Ronnie and what he has to say. The subjects that you cover are right down the alley that I've been going down for the last 30 years. So I think we're going to have a really great conversation. I personally am an artist, and I do art and illustration, a lot of different band and festival merch, as well as mom and pop shops, but if you want to check out my stuff, I have my Meta Mindcast, the podcast, as well as all my art on my website, my Etsy, as well as my social media. You can find all of that on my Linktree, which is Linktree RMARX, and that'll pull up everything.
Awesome. Thank you very much, sir. Yeah. And now finally on to the guest. Ronnie, please let everybody know what your deal is.
Hey, you can find my stuff on all the platforms, Blue Sky, Threads, Facebook, X, Substack, TikTok, YouTube. I've got a channel there where you can see over 100 archived interviews, and also videos I've done about specific subjects, stories I tell that I hope are life-changing. And I'm a musician, an author. I've produced documentary films, and I'm really happy to be here.
Yes. That was actually something I had written down too, but I figured I had read so much already, I wasn't going to keep going. But yeah, you've also done, you've contributed essays to an Invisible College magazine, Metapsychosis, Occult of Personality, and Reality Sandwich. So yes, thank you. Before we get into the book, I do want to ask, I'm sure after I just mentioned you worked for Manly P. Hall, people are probably like, what was that like? So if you don't mind, just not putting you on the spot, just if you maybe just give us a little bit of an idea what that experience was like for you, sir.
Sure, it's going to be a little lengthy to give you context. It's not as easy as all that. But I want you all, if I'm going to talk about him, I want you to appreciate, what he did for me. Okay. So I was, by the time I was in my late teens, I was a nihilist and a criminal. And I was violent. I had a band that was racist and had a big following of bikers, and my security was bikers, and a lot of people were getting beat up around us, and that's what I was into. I wanted to spread my nihilism and disillusion everybody, and kind of hurry up what I consider the imminent doom of the human race, because the planet Earth would be better without us. that has a lot to do with my background. I'm a kid from family who, a lot of people died during war, and never adjusted to life. And I grew up like kind of a runt and a loner, and I had no social contract, and got my ass kicked so often wherever I went that I just became that other person. First, I fell in love with somebody who asked me for help at this club. She was in a bad situation, and for some reason chose me, the most reprehensible person there, to help her. And she was I'm still with her. That's Tamara Lucid, my partner and everything. She's like this incredible, honest, funny, just deeply connected to some kind of primal spirituality kind of person. Even though she was every bit as cynical as I was, she kind of helped me to get over my hatred of life. But I was still really messed up. I tried to be a drug dealer, but I used up everything that I bought. I was just not headed for a good end. And I got lucky one day when my parents, in some kind of fit of optimism, gave me money for a haircut, and I took it to a place called the Bodhi Tree Bookstore, which was this incredible metaphysical bookstore in Los Angeles that no longer exists. It was kind of the archetype of all metaphysical bookstores. And there I found in the used branch this book by Manly Hall, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, except this was an early edition, kind of this reduced black and white version, but it was a tome, and it had the long name, an encyclopedic outline of hermetic alchemical. And, it was just, it looked to me like, wow, this is a book that like a wizard would own, or a magician would own. And I'd already been into what is now called chaos magic, but I'd kind of put it together myself through Crowley and Austin Spare, and I had used it for my band and for my own personal power and things like that. So at first I approached it like, here are the secrets, this is going to enable me to accomplish my aims. But what I found was something completely different, which was this entirely new, to me, view of the world, which began with the dedication of the book to the rational soul of the world, which just that stopped me dead. I was like, what? To me, the world was chaos, and was consciousness was an accident, a cruel, twist of fate on humanity that we get to know how messed up everything is. And all of a sudden, here's this person, obviously with this great knowledge, all these words and all this art in this book that I haven't even read yet. And he's saying, I dedicate this to the rational soul of the world. I was like, really? Okay. Well, every chapter I read, I felt like onion layers around my brain were being removed. And suddenly, like Emerson said, I became like this giant transparent eyeball, and I felt like I was connected to the whole universe. And suddenly I was feeling these feelings of like, whoa, like awe, and reading about people, including the Rosicrucians, who he discusses in the book at length, who had devoted their lives to trying to discover, who are we really? What are we? Why are we here? And who had risked their lives in order to pursue these studies and these explorations, and even more so, to write them down and to publish them and share them with others. And there were people that were executed for this kind of work. And that moved me. I just thought, wow, the courage of these people and their creativity. And so I read the book, and I thought for sure the guy was dead, because the picture in front, he already looked like an older man, and the book was from the 1920s. I just thought, no way he's alive. But I mentioned it to a friend of mine who was kind of a mentor to me, this former carnival dancer, a really nice woman. And she said, honey, he's lecturing every Sunday not far from where you live. I was like, no way. And she was like, yeah, he's like almost 80, and I guess he was 80, and he's yeah, and he's like, it costs $1 every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. You should go. It's a great experience.
Oh, it's like an AA. It's cheap as hell.
I know, right? And he never charged more than $1. And so I kept stalling, because I knew who I'd been, and I just thought that somebody like this was going to look right through me. And I felt like, oh man, I can't go to this place. There's gonna be all these nice, intelligent people, and I'm gonna walk in here, and they're gonna feel all my criminality on me. Is how I felt. And Tamara kept working on me. She kept saying, man, you're gonna feel stupid if he dies, and you've never seen him. I mean, why would you do that? So eventually, one beautiful spring day, we went down there on that Sunday morning, and that beautiful little place. It's this weird combination of Egyptian and Mayan architecture, kind of hidden, but in the middle of everything in LA. And there were all these older people. I think we were by far the youngest people there. And they were all sort of astonished to see people as young as us walk in there. And we sat down in the auditorium. Big man comes out, sits down and starts talking. 90 minutes, no notes, dropping names and dates, and just absolutely right there blew my mind about the idea that when you age, you get dumb. It was like, no, he didn't, And but he also did something that I later found out he often did. He looked right at me, and he delivered a message, right? And so I had been freaking out because that carnival dancer mentor of mine was into Edgar Cayce. And Edgar Cayce had said that California was going to sink into the ocean. And for whatever reason, my friend was like convinced it was going to happen any day. And she was moving to Virginia Beach. And she was telling me, you've got to move. You got to get out of here. It's going to be a terrible disaster. And I fell for it. I was like, holy shit, I got to get out of LA and I've got to get to Virginia Beach. So he looks right at me and he says, people who suffer paranoid fantasies about natural disasters because of the way they've been living their lives, it's guilt. I was like, how did he do that? Now, later, when I became his screener, but also just speaking to people around him when I worked at PRS, I found out that he did it all the time. And the weirdest thing about it is he couldn't see us. Because when I worked with him, I found out that his eyesight was really bad. I mean, we looked like colorful blurs out there in the audience, and yet somehow his eyes always fell on the right person with this particular message. Every time he went out there, a few people would get these kind of messages. Now, was he psychic? Was this... I like to think that he was so deeply in what the Chinese call the Tao, that he just was the synchronicities, because he had so many synchronicities around him, including my arrival. So I was so blown away, so moved by what he had to say. I just loved him instantly. And the people were all so nice. And it was just such a great... I never seen anything so wholesome in my life. And they were also intelligent. And I could hear these words around me: reincarnation, Blavatsky, karma, all this stuff that I didn't really know when I wanted to know. And so Tamara and I decided to volunteer. We would do anything just to help out this organization and be around him and help him out. So we went down there the next morning to do that. And they loved her because she'd worked a number of jobs in her teens. And so, they were like, do you have office skills? She was like, yeah, I worked in a bank for a while. Oh, great. Do you know how to do this? Yes. And then they come to me and it's like, well, I fronted a nihilist band that bikers liked, I had nothing. And they kept like asking questions. And then finally, one question was, do either of you have any knowledge of foreign languages? And I said, yeah, I do. I said, I grew up around German and Russian and Polish and French, and but I don't speak them, I don't. And she was like, really? Okay. Well, we'll get back to you. Well, they call up the next day and they give Tamara this offer for a job. And me, nothing. So I was still a dick at that time. And I said, hey, fuck no, man. I'm not sitting at home with the cats and, you get to go and work at PRS. So forget it. If they don't want me, they can't have you. And she was like, great. I didn't want to do a job anyway. Like that. And so next thing that happens is there's another call the following day. And they tell me that Manly Hall wants to meet me. I'm like, what? They're like, tomorrow morning, first thing, come down, and he wants to talk to you. I barely slept that night. I was just blown away that I would get to meet him. I had no clue. Why does he want to talk to me? So they show me into his office, which was this huge, beautiful room filled with art from China and Japan, mostly Asian art, but all kinds of art. And he's sitting behind this ornate Chinese desk carved with dragons and things. I mean, just beautiful furniture in there that he'd acquired over many years. And much of it had been given to him by admirers or either donated or willed to him upon their deaths. And there were 4 women, 2 standing on either side of him with their arms crossed like a phalanx, right? And they were looking at me with a skunk eye. But he smiled when I walked in, and he did this kind of cross between W.C. Fields and Barrymore accent he would do sometimes when he was joking around. And I won't do it justice, but he said, "Come on in and make yourself miserable." Or I think it was actually, "Sit down and make yourself miserable." And so it made me laugh. I sat down, and then he pushed this big pile of paper in front of me. And he said, "Do you know what a galley is?" And I was like, "A ship?" And he went, "Do you know what a bibliography is?" And I was like, "No, I don't know what a bibliography is, really. I mean, it's the back of a book, right, where they list the books." And he said, "Do you have any familiarity with alchemy?" And I said, "I've just read your book, and I've read a couple chapters, but that's all I know." And he said, "Okay. Well, this is the galley," which means the rough, "of my alchemical bibliography, of my collection of alchemical and Rosicrucian books and manuscripts.
Nice.
And I need somebody to edit this for me, because the current editor has done things that I don't want him to do," which was he put bodily fluids, information about bodily fluids used in alchemical recipes into the book. And Manly Hall was like, "This is a bibliography. This isn't a book of alchemical recipes. And I don't want people to hurt themselves. They're not experienced, and that they hear, you know, that urine can be used for this or that or something. I don't want that in the book." Well, this guy was an academic, and he said, "Well, it's staying in the book because this is important information." So he needed somebody to come in and take over from this academic and finish the bibliography. So I said, "That's incredibly, what an honor, but you've got the wrong guy." You know, I said, my education was terrible. I'm not that fluent in any of these languages. You know, these are measurements of books and historical information and all this stuff. It's just way over my head. And he said, "Well, I will help you. I know you can do it. Why don't you take this galley and go sit in the library and look it over, and then you can come back in and tell me what you think." So I pick it up. I start walking into the library, and the vice president of the society, who'd been in the military, and I mean, she was really an amazing woman, Pat Irvin. She like basically ran around the side of the library and got in front of me before I could get anywhere, and said, "That was a mistake," and took the galley from me. And I said, "Thank you. That was a mistake." But I was still thrilled. I was like, wow, I met him and he wanted to work with me. I mean, this is amazing, right? So I go home, and there's a phone call, this time from his secretary. And so there is this invitation to come back and talk to him again the next morning. And it's very serious. It's like, "Look, he wants to talk to you tomorrow morning. Now come in here. This is important." Okay. So I come back the next morning. Now it's just him. And the first thing he says to me is, "Young man, from now on, if anybody tells you anything that contradicts what I tell you to do, you come to me and you tell me. You will take orders only from me." And he said, "This is how we're going to do it. In the morning, you will come in. I will show you what I want you to work on. You'll go work on it. In the afternoon before I leave, you'll come in and I'll look at your work. I'll make suggestions and corrections. You are welcome to have lunch with me in the vault with the manuscripts and the books, and you can ask me about anything." Well, wow. You know, I have to tell you, the lunch in the vault thing, that was like that I was like, okay, you know, yes, I'm going to try. And so I turned out to be really good at it. And then the amazing thing was being in the vault with him. I mean, all my books started in conversations with him in the vault, where he would show me something For instance, the American Metaphysical Religion book started when he said, pick out something. And there was this big leather-bound volume that was on the bottom shelf, and it was called The Platonist. And I was like, what's that? So I grabbed it, and as I'm pulling it out, he says, oh, that's a good one. So I was like, okay. So I open it, and it's a newspaper. It's bound issues of a newspaper that was published in St. Louis when it was like a cow town around the time of the gunfight at the OK Corral. And it's filled with translations of Plato and even weirder stuff like Abner Doubleday, who did not invent baseball but was a Civil War general. He translated Transcendental Magic by Eliphas Levi in this thing, in a serial version, chapter by chapter. And I'm like going, what? And, you know, I'm like picturing like a, you know, wooden sidewalks and gunfighters walking around, and there's some freak, you know, that's, you know, like producing a newspaper about Plato in the 1880s. So I asked him about it, and he said, you know, we don't know much about it. We know about Alexander Wilder, who wrote for it, but there's very little information about this. So that totally captured my imagination. And at the time, there was no access to it. I mean, there were probably, God, I mean, very few copies of this newspaper left anywhere in the world. And it was just luck that I'd run into it. And then I had this other stroke of luck a little while later where I was out with Tamara at a place across from the Whiskey A Go-Go. It was this great store called the Hippocampus. And it had been there since like the 1960s, and Jim Morrison and Hendrix and everybody had shopped in there. This incredible woman had run it. Now she was quite aged, and she had a great gay guy running it. And I walk in there. We used to just go there because they had the coolest stuff. I mean, just the weirdest, interesting things. And they had this little pile of books, kind of decorative looking. And I look at it, and one of them was a bound edition of The Platonist, just like Manly Hall had. I was blown away, you know, like, whoa, this is the same. It was the same thing. The newspaper's bound in a leather binding. Well, you know, across from the whiskey, one of the chapters in American Metaphysical Religion is called The Platonist on the Sunset Strip, because that started the book. And so we thought, I mean, that must have been worth thousands of dollars easily. And so we came up with them and said, we'd like to buy these, but we're not sure we can afford them. How much are they? And he said, I don't know. Let me call her. He goes in back. He calls her up, comes out, and he says, what's it for? Are you just putting them on a bookshelf for decor, or are you going to read them? And we said, oh, God, we're going to read them. Yeah, no, this is for reading. She sold it to us for $100, which is insane, you know. So that sealed it. You know, that ultimately became, because now we're able to read every page whenever we want, and it became the American Metaphysical Religion book. And even when we went out after PRS and we got into a band and we were touring nationally, we would go to bookstores and to university libraries and looking for information about the people that wrote for the Platonist. And eventually we found this little book that had been published in 1962 about Platonism in the Midwest. And it told the story of how the New England transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau and Alcott, were all really into Plato, and they got the whole country really into Plato. And like they were, like the New York Times and magazines and stuff were carrying stories about Plato, and there were Plato parties in the West, like on the frontier. Especially women, but also men who were interested in this stuff would get together, and they would like celebrate Plato's birthday. They read a dialogue and discuss it, or write poems about Plato, and it's really cool things were happening. So then there was this explosion in academia around the 2000s, where suddenly esoteric material was being studied. You know, for centuries it was considered superstition, and people didn't look at it. In religious studies, you were considered crazy if you were looking at the Pentecostals, but you didn't look at anything like the Theosophists or the Rosicrucians or things like that. That was considered beneath you. These were not historical institutions that influenced the fate of humanity. They actually were, but according to the official line, they weren't. And around it started kind of in the 80s, but especially blew up in 2000 with the publication of a book by Catherine Albanese called The Republic of Mind and Reason. Wait a minute. Public of. Oh, I can't believe I've forgotten it. I think it's Mind and Reason, but I'm not sure. I got it wrong, but it's definitely Catherine Albanese. And she's the first one who kind of looked at the history of America and said, look at this incredible influence. Everywhere you look, there's Kabbalah, astrology, alchemy. There's an alchemy lab at Harvard. There's presidents who are in friends with alchemists. There's this huge esoteric influence from the very earliest days of the colonies all the way through. So that's just one thing, one book that I picked up, and it wound up being a lifetime's worth of study. And there were other books that have been published that started the same way, with just something that he told me a story about. And so that's how I met him. Now, what was it like working with him? He was, first, he was, as I use the word, wholesome. I've never met anybody so wholesome. There's been kind of a potboiler bio published of him that alleged a lot of stuff, and kind of tries to make him look like a fraud, maybe even. He had diet problems, and he was allegedly plagiarized Jung, and all sorts of reasons that we were supposed to dismiss him. But I found that most of that was, first, very human things. He did like cookies and hamburgers, and he didn't really eat too much of it. He ate some when he could get it. As far as the plagiarism, he came from a very different time, in the same way that Blavatsky did, where if you were inspired by something, you kind of wrote about it. And you weren't going to be putting footnotes in there about, I got this from so-and-so. And you were just like taking these great, wise observations about humanity and then sharing them in your own way, changing them somewhat. But that was a very common practice for much longer, especially in esotericism, than actually being very careful, as we are now, about your sources so people can follow up on it. He was funny. I mean, he'd tell you jokes all the time, and his jokes always had a spiritual message to you if you paid attention. So, for example, he started inviting Tamara and I to dinner at his house with he and his wife Marie, or they would take us out to dinner. And so we would have all these great conversations. And the first time that we went over to his house for dinner, he told us a very long joke about, which I'm just going to give you a snippet of, about an outlaw in early California who is escaping from the authorities. Then he shows up where there's this preacher, one of the very early Christians in the area, who's establishing missions. And this guy finds him wounded. And so the priest helps him, and the outlaw never tells him his name, won't tell him where he came from or how he got shot, anything about it. But he starts helping the priest because he has a sense of honor. And he's like, look, you nursed me back to health. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to do things for you. I'm going to be there for you. Okay. The priest takes him around, and he says, well, we're going to call you Dominic then, Brother Dominic. And the big punchline comes when the priest it brings all the richest landowners in the area together and gives them this stirring speech about the mission in California. And then they're all very moved, and they leave. And at the end of it, the priest goes, oh, God, forgive me. I forgot to ask for the charity. That's why I did this, so we could gather more money to build more missions. And how could I do that? And Dominic says, no, you told me to do it, and I did it. He said, what did I say? So this is a joke about the Catholic Dominic Fiscum, right? And so it was, you said Dominic Friscum, and I did. And so he's got all these jewels and stuff that he's ripped off from these people. So now, this is the interesting thing about that story. I was a thief. Part of my criminality was, even from early childhood, I was a really good sneak thief, and I was into it. I was nuts. I was even I would creep into people's houses just to show my talents to myself. Can I do this? Yes, I can. And I stole all kinds of shit in my early years. And when I got in that library, oh my God! I mean, can you imagine? I mean, I wanted to steal everything. And there were certain books that hit me like, man, I want that book. I don't know why, but I was just like, I want that book. And it wasn't that important a book. It wasn't in the vault, they would never miss it. I was like I was fighting it. And so he tells me that joke, right? And I didn't really put it together. I had talked to Tamara about this issue, my urge to thieve, and she said, as we were walking out of their house, "Wow, he just plucked you." And I was like, "What?" He said, "It's a joke." And she said, "Don't you get it? That's you. You're Dominic." It's a joke about somebody who steals compulsively. And then, as if to prove it, the next day at work, I come in the morning and he says to me, "By the way, you can take any book that you want home with you, and you can keep it as long as you want. Just bring it back when you're done." You know, so it took me a while, by the way, to take the ones I really wanted home, but eventually I did, and I brought them back. And but he did that kind of thing a lot, and he did it for everybody. That's what I mean by his way with synchronicity. He was constantly this source of light to people, but he never was pretentious. He would, like, if you sat down to talk with him and you wanted to talk about heavy things, he would turn it around to the Dodgers or something, you know, like the Dodgers were good last night, you know. And but he would, you know, he was really kind to me. Like, he would sit with me and he would talk to me about he let me ask him all sorts of things. And for instance, once he was doing this article on astrology, and I was a dick enough to say, "Really? Like, you believe in astrology?" Like, I'm shocked. And he laughed and he said, "Oh, well, you want to debate it?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess so." And he said, "Well, then you've got to learn something about it. Let me get you a friend of mine who will do your chart, and she'll teach you the basics, and then you're welcome to come in here." Now, he knew that she was going to blow my mind. And she read my chart and Tamara's, completely blew our mind. So we knew, wow, okay, something's going on here. And then we started studying it. And I still do a weekly astrology report, and I still, you know, I call things correctly a lot, and it blows my mind every time. I still don't get it, you know, like, how does this work? Even like completely different systems. Like, you can take a Hindu astrologer and an American astrologer using just typical Western esoteric astrology, completely different way of looking at the planets and the stars, and yet good astrologers in any of these systems, or the ancient Greek or any of them, they will blow your mind and read your soul back to you, read your life experiences. And I still think that's a great mystery. And I have my theories about it. I don't think that the stars cause us to do things. I think that we're all part of this, like, call it quantum entanglement. We're all signifying to each other. We're all in the same moment together, full of meaning for each other. And I think that includes the planets. And so they're like signposts, or as it says in the Bible, you know, they're signs in the sky for us.
Right.
There's certainly some kind of knowledge there that is undeniable. But that's what he was like. He would do delightful things, like that he'd find some incredible treasure that was hidden in some drawer somewhere. And he'd say, "Oh, I forgot about that." He'd tell a story about it. And he'd say, "You know what, put that in the gift shop for somebody." And he'd give it a price that was ridiculously low, you know, just so somebody could wander in there and afford a treasure from Japan. He was that kind of a person. So, yeah, I thought he'd completely turned my life around. He made me an ethical, honest human being. He made me love culture and love life, and turned me on to even the secret of the golden flower. Which is my main system of study and practice. He turned me on to that. He had already written about it way back in the 30s or something, and I talked to him a bit about it. And so he's where I first got the interest in Rosicrucianism. He was really into it, and he actually gave me his own copy of A.E. Waite's Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, which had some notes from him penciled into it, which I just thought was, you know, amazing gift. And that's how I got into Rosicrucianism, and that's what he was like. I highly recommend him, especially his lectures. Everybody has to understand that when he was writing, he did not have access like we do to all this archived information and academic work. And so some of his stuff is questionable in terms of the actual historical incidents as they're described, because it represents what I would call a theosophical viewpoint on it, which still has a lot of value. But if you're looking for like accurate historical record, you might find him off here and there because his sources were off, and he didn't have access to proof that they were off. Whereas today we have that. And that's the origin of my Rosicrucian book, because there was a lot of new study in Rosicrucianism since 2000. Amazing stuff. Archives have been opened and things that have never been seen before by top-notch scholars. And I kept running into things that made me say to myself, you know, oh man, I wish I could go into that room of his, and, you know, and walk up to him and go, look at this, you know, and share it with him. I know how thrilled he would have been. And then I thought, you should take all this material and bring it together so that other people, because you can't, these books are so ridiculously expensive and they're intimidating and they're hard to read, but they contain these wonderful insights into what Rosicrucianism was, how it originated, and how it evolved.
That is great.
What an absolutely beautiful story.
Yeah, that's wild. Thank you so much. Fortunately, I'm sorry I made you spend 35 minutes.
I knew that was going to happen.
Yeah, no, I feel bad going into stuff now.
It's a lot to try to get across, you know.
Yeah. Robby, Elisa, was there anything you wanted to ask or say before?
Oh, I just enjoyed hearing the little tidbits of stuff that you know you can't experience anywhere else. But as far as Rosicrucianism, I was wondering, like in your researches, because you hear this stuff about what is it, Francis Bacon, you hear stuff about the Jesuit ties in, you hear stuff about the roaming like Hebrew Kabbalists and, you know, the medieval times kind of coming in. And as far as the origin of the Rosicrucian philosophy itself, what kind of root have you found in regard to that?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's a mystery within a mystery. I mean, there's very little that we're sure of about any of it. That's part of the beauty of it to me.
Yeah.
Now, when you look for origins, you have that problem of where do we draw the line? Like, where do we stop? There's so many kind of influences that are coming into these Rosicrucian manifestos. But I like to start with Ficino and of course Pico, because here we have two people who are allegedly Christian. I mean, they're both. I mean, Ficino's a priest, and yet they are translating Plato. Pico's trying to make a Christian Kabbalah. Ficino's doing a lot of what's going to be Rosicrucian philosophy, and his doing a lot of what's going to be Paracelsian medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And Paracelsus calls Ficino the greatest of all the Italian doctors. And there's a lot of Ficino in the early work of Paracelsus, and Agrippa and Paracelsus lean heavily on Ficino. And both of them, like Ficino, their major works were divided into 3 books, which I think was because of Ficino. And so that's a whole nother. Ficino, by the way, amazing conversation. The father of the Renaissance. I mean, just doing the hymns of Orpheus for Michelangelo and for the de Medicis and all the great artists of the time, Botticelli, and we probably don't have Botticelli's Venus if it isn't for Ficino singing the hymn to Venus. Oh
wow.
Yeah. So then you've got. So you have this Renaissance, and in it is all this esoteric knowledge, the Neoplatonists, the Hermetica, Plato, all of which was translated by Ficino for the first time in generations. It had been lost during the Dark Ages.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get other writers, you get Giordano Bruno, this brilliant mind, philosopher and scientist, who gets burned at the stake in 1600 for his beliefs, partly because he said that the earth goes around the sun and the universe doesn't go around the earth. And he had ideas about reforming the world. And you had writers who were already talking about the universal reformation, this idea that the world could be transformed, and really through science, which was just beginning in alchemy and astrology and these practices. And then you had a bunch of celestial events at the end of the 1500s and the very beginning of the 1600s, a supernova. You had one of the biggest comets that had ever come over Europe. And the world's looking up at this and going, wow, what's happening? And you had astrologers and prophets on both sides, right? So on the Catholic side, they were saying, this is the end of the Protestants. This is the beginning of the reestablishment of Catholic domination over all of Europe. And in the Protestant side, this is the end of the Catholic Church. We're going to end the popes, and Protestants are going to take over all of Europe, right? So people were high on this sense that there was a big change coming, whichever direction they were going. Now, we've already got people inside the Catholic Church and among the Protestants who are reading Ficino, and they're reading The Alchemists, and they're going to read Agrippa, and they're into this stuff. And there's this fantasy growing among the Protestants of the Hermetic king or the Hermetic emperor, right. Plato's philosopher king.
Very much.
And we've got the perfect one, right? Rudolph II, who is this, he is into the Hermetica, he's into the Kabbalah, he's into astrology. The greatest astronomers of the age are in his court. He has a doctrine of freedom of religion. I mean, he moves the capital of the Holy Roman Empire from Venice to Prague because he wants to get away from his mother and the Catholic Church. And he doesn't want to be, he's not really into being an emperor. He hates the job. He doesn't want to have to take the meetings and tell everybody everything, look at the laws and tell who's the criminal here and all that. He wants to be around the painters that he's collected who are making masterpieces. He wants to go to his alchemical lab station in the giant room full of alchemists. Most of the famous alchemists were in that room at one time or another, working for him, trying to make gold or trying to make the Philosopher's Stone or the universal medicine. And that's his thrills in life. He loves collecting paintings from all over the world. He has a lion that walks around with him, his pet lion, like a big cat, and sleeps at his feet. And he sends artists to distant corners of his empire to paint things that he's never going to be able to see. And that's how he lives. So people look at him and they think, this is the perfect antidote to the Pope and to the Habsburgs. Right. Even though he is a Habsburg, because they are scheming to take over all of Europe again. And I want everybody listening to understand what that means, because right now we're afraid of a surveillance state, right? We've got, Palinters out there doing their thing, and so the church had it. It was the confessional, right? Yeah. Like everybody had to confess, and every priest had to tell his superior if it was something important.
Yeah.
And that went all the way up to the Pope if it was important enough. That is a surveillance state unlike any that we've ever seen. True. And so they wanted to reestablish that throughout the world. And the Protestants were like, we want to get rid of you. We think you're corrupt, this whole hierarchy and your wealth and your, what are you doing? This isn't Jesus. This has nothing to do with what Jesus was talking about. So they started to fantasize about maybe we can get Rudolph to declare himself the Holy Roman Hermetic Emperor, and he will stand up against the church for us and stop this. Well, Rudolph gets visited by John Dee, Queen Elizabeth's court wizard, one of the great roots of all the esoteric stuff in the West. And he's talking to angels at that time with Edward Kelly. And he has a meeting that goes disastrously because he tells Rudolph, the angels told me that if you don't do this, terrible things will happen to you. And you must unite Europe in a holy war. And Rudolph's like, nice to meet you. I never want to see you again. Yeah. And so that doesn't work. But other people also come at him. Michael Meyer and other famous names from this era try to convince him, but no way, he's not into it. And he becomes more and more a target of the Catholic Church. They're like, we got to remove this guy. He's this freedom of religion stuff. This is bad. And he's supporting the Protestants. While that's going on, we get the beginning of this Rosicrucian revolution. And it starts out, a lot of this happens in Tübingen around some students. And of course, Andre in particular is the one that everybody looks at as now, is this the guy at the center of it? I kind of think that he was, and I'll tell you why. in a moment. But Andre was a young student at this point. He's like 19 years old or something. And he's got radical professors who've been studying Giordano Bruno and Ficino and Boethius and all sorts of Studion, and these writers who are writing about, you know, very esoteric metaphysical viewpoints on the world, but also about how there's about to be this revolution where the world is going to be opened up. And this is the nearing of the end times, and knowledge will return to humanity, Adam's lost knowledge. And they're actually thinking, why don't we hurry it up by finding this knowledge? Like, we're, you know, instead of waiting for it, let's get it. Let's do scientific experiments. Let's share our knowledge. And so that's an exciting idea, you know, that this universal reformation, because they were in a stagnant world that they were sick of. They were tired of the constant battle between the Protestants and the Catholics. No one was getting along, and everything ground to a halt. And there was this cultural malaise that kind of filled everything. And so, of course, this brilliant young college student was like, break me out of this. This is the 1600s, man. You know, the 1500s are over. Right. And so the first thing that happens is a book is written called the Fama. It starts circulating probably by 1609, maybe. There's some good scholarship that shows that there are references to a particular discovery in the making of telescopes that is referred to in kind of a metaphorical way that probably means it couldn't have been written before about 1609. It starts to circulate in manuscript form, and I don't think it was ever intended to do anything but that. It's basically comparable to me to like Ginsberg's Howl. It's this kind of, you know, incredible combination of, it's surreal, it's science fiction, it is esoteric, but it's political and radical. It's talking about killing the Pope, and it's funny. There's little inside jokes in it, and there's puzzles that you can figure out, and they lead to things like Andre's coat of arms. His family coat of arms is hidden in one of the stories, and it tells this whole myth about Father CRC, who was the founder of the Rosicrucians, you know, a long time before that. And they found his tomb where his body was perfectly preserved, and in it was the book M, which had all the knowledge of the world. And this was about declaration of universal reformation. The Rosicrucian Brotherhood now exists, and we're going to help make this happen. And, you know, you don't have to write to us or anything, but you know, if you're somebody who's like us, we'll find you, and you can join us in this. And I think it was kind of a joke. And Andre referred to it as a joke, a ludibrium, and not a joke in the sense of just a farce making fun of everybody, but this kind of cultural hoax, you know, of a fantasy that captures all these ideas that you're trying to get out there that represent a new generation, a new way of looking at the world. There were people all around around Europe, and even in the colonies, the very earliest colonies, we'll find them, who are interested in these matters, but they hide it, and they don't know that there's anybody else like them out there. That's why I compare it to Howl, because it's something that galvanizes a generation. It gets published in 1614, and the way it got published is weird, because nobody involved in its creation had anything to do with publishing it. It was published by Moritz the Learned, who it had his area very near where Rudolf had his, and this guy was really into starting a war with the Catholics, and he was really into Catholicism, but also really into the esotericism. But he wanted a freer culture. He wanted science, and he wanted to break free from this stranglehold that the culture that had been the 1500s had on Europe at that time. So he publishes it like, great, you know, let's put this out and see what happens. Well, what happens, no one expected. It was like this giant explosion of a reaction. Hundreds of books and pamphlets were published in the next few years in reaction to that one little thing. And there were, on one side, people were saying, this is evil, this is a trick of the Jesuits, this is that. No, they're not Jesuits. It's the devil's Jesuits.
Yeah.
And it's, this is some kind of occult plot to throw over Europe. But on the other side, it was hailed by people who've been quietly working on similar ideas, who've been reading these forbidden authors, and who felt exactly the same way, and undoubtedly read the Fama in the way that the people who became the Beats read Howl.
Right.
And found themselves in it and had a sense of, whoa, maybe the future does belong to us. Well, Andre, well, we'll wait before we go there. So a year later, there's a book published called The Confession of the Rosy Cross. This is a book that it's still kind of a joking, it's satirical on a level, but it's also trying to say, hey, you guys got it all wrong. Okay, the reaction to the Fama, that wasn't what we were trying for. Like, we don't want you all writing us letters, writing public pamphlets and publishing. I want to be a Rosicrucian, and then being mad at us and publishing another one saying, fuck them, they didn't make me a Rosicrucian. This is about universal reformation, your own corner of the universe. Like learning and this is good stuff. It's not about war, actually, even though we mentioned it. Well, that book is completely misunderstood as well, and only feeds the fire. And then finally, 1 year later, the most satirical of the books, Chemical Wedding, is released. And here we have Father CRC is now this kind of old man, and there's this sexy naked girl showing him around, and we see Aphrodite naked. I mean, it's a hot piece of literature for the 1600s, and but it's also clearly seems to me to be in a reaction to the next thing that occurred politically, which was Rudolph was deposed, a Catholic, his brother took over. No more freedom of religion. You all got to be Catholic or get out of Prague or suffer some kind of persecution. And well, in Prague, this was like the Bohemians were like, and they threw some of the officials of the empire out these windows onto dung piles and declared themselves free. And then we had in the Palatinate this whole other story, which my book tells in detail, about Frederick, who was this young guy who had incredible bloodline going back to the Roman emperors. I mean, really long time royal family. Who was one of the electors of the emperor, and who married Princess Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of King James. Right. This was seen by the same people who wanted to get Rudolph to stand up as, wow, wait a minute, now we've got the British and the Germans together. Yeah. Let's do this, And so their wedding was seen as this very important Hermetic event politically. And it had Shakespeare, did The Tempest for their marriage, and Midsummer Night's Dream was performed for their marriage, and Francis Bacon was doing incredible things, and it was like this beautiful flowering of culture that occurred around it. And when they went back to Heidelberg, again, there was this flowering of culture. There was a beautiful garden built that had these statues that were based on the knowledge of the ancients, who knew how to make statues that could move or make sounds in a wind, or these great, mechanical inventions. And to the Catholics, that garden was considered black magic and a gateway to hell. But to the esoterics, it was a symbol of the power of science to transform a bleak place into a beautiful paradise. And so they looked at Frederick and said, Bohemians looked at Frederick and said, hey, come to Prague and be the king of Bohemia. And then maybe you'll be the emperor next. Wouldn't that be nice? A Protestant emperor who's really into the Hermetica. So Frederick, he thought, well, this has to be a calling from God. I got to go there and protect the Protestants. It was the worst possible decision he could have made. It basically started the 30 Years' War. He was surrounded by enemies and spies there, so everything he did was betrayed. And when finally the war broke out, he lost it so quickly that he became a joke to Europe, and had to flee. and lost everything. Prague was sacked. Heidelberg was sacked. One of the greatest libraries in the world was taken away to the Habsburgs and to the Vatican. And his life and Elizabeth's, I mean, they never kind of recovered from what occurred. And in a way, Europe didn't, because it unleashed plague and war that killed, what was it, like 1 out of 10, I think? Some incredible number of Europeans died during that period. But it unleashed this Rosicrucian mythology on the world. And so now, why Andre? First, we find Andre at a very young age. He's already writing utopias, and he's already writing satirical kind of plays that are in the tone of, let's say, The Chemical Wedding. Mm-hmm. But to me, maybe the most convincing aspect, and there have been studies of the language, you know, so people say, well, from that point of view, he certainly wrote The Chemical Wedding. We're pretty sure of that, but it doesn't look like he wrote the Confessio and the Fama. Mm-hmm. I think that it was written by a group. It was like a zine almost, you know, different people put it together. But he publishes 1 year after The Chemical Wedding. So again, we've got the Fama in 1614, the Confession in 1615, the Chemical Wedding in 1616, and then Andre, under his own name, in 1617, he publishes this book that's called The Tower of Babel. Mm-hmm. And this is a satirical collection of 75 allegorical characters. And each of them has a unique, dare I say, uniquely stupid opinion about the Rosicrucians. And so in this, it's a very cathartic book, I think, for him. And what he's doing is he's introducing us to all the people who overreacted and that disillusioned him and his friends. So they are, for instance, young nonconformists, right? Who they don't care what they just want to rebel. And pious fools who don't get it at all, but they're so pious. And opportunistic pseudoscientists who think the Rosicrucians were a great way for hustling money out of people. And false prophets. Yes, I'm a Rosicrucian. A lot of the Paracelsian doctors decided they were Rosicrucians because everything that was said in those books, we do that. Hey, we're the Rosicrucians. Self-righteous fanatics. And then my favorite, the aristocratic connoisseurs of art. Right. And I mean, today we see the same thing. You know, I used to write for Reality Sandwich. That's who, you know, like at Burning Man, you met a lot of those people, you know, young nonconformists, pious fools, righteous fanatics, aristocratic connoisseurs of art, false prophets, pseudoscientists. They were all there, you know. So
hasn't changed.
That is that's one reason why I think that he wrote it, because, man, I mean, only the guy who wrote those books would turn around and go, and then there were these assholes and these assholes and these assholes, you know. And then he rewrites a lot of the ideas in these books in a more serious way later in his books like Christianopolis, where he's doing utopias about how should life be, how should we live, what should society be like. And it's interesting to me also that one of the most brilliant minds that comes out of this period, Comenius, who's like the father of modern education, he's the guy who invented the whole idea of like middle school, high school, you know, the split levels of education. And he had some wonderful ideas. He thought that everybody should be taught to read and write and do math. Everybody, women, every race, indigenous people, everybody should have that gift. He wanted to convene something called the College of Light, where all the most brilliant minds of the day would be brought together, and they would work together and train the next generation while they were doing it to bring science into the world, to get medical discoveries and to find out, you know, what are the stars doing? What do they mean? And just everything, you know, find out all the secrets of nature to make life better. And when he was very influenced by the Rosicrucians, and when he got into it, and he wanted to become a Rosicrucian, he did some research. And who do you think he sent a letter to saying, sir, I have reason to believe that you're the right one. I want to be a Rosicrucian. You're the one to ask. He sent it to Andre. And Andre sent it back to him and said, it was kind of a joke. The Rosicrucian Society is just me and some friends, and it's not really something that, you know, we can like matriculate you into. People didn't understand, you know. So for instance, I'll give you an idea of the misunderstanding. So the invisible college, right?
Yeah.
Well, part of that was, one, they had to be, because if they weren't, they would get killed, right? Like Bruno had just been burned at the stake. And also they were invisible because they were the spiritual, you know, they were into the invisible side of the world, right? Like the unobstructed, once again. They were not just looking at the visible, they were also into the invisible side of it. Thought and spirituality, the soul is invisible. And that's what we're after. But it became the power of invisibility, right? People thought, oh, the Rosicrucian, you know, adepts, they can appear anywhere. And this has been called Theosophical Rosicrucianism, which I think is a good name for it. And I had that really bad, by the way. Tamara wrote this book about our friendship with Manly Hall. It's really wonderful. If you're interested in him as a person, I highly recommend it. It's called Making the Ordinary Extraordinary. And she tells us a lot of humor in it, a lot of it at my expense. And one of the funniest is that I've had what she calls Rosicrucian fever, which is not uncommon, which is you want to be an initiate, you know, you want to have that Rosicrucian materialize in your study and tell you what a good student you are. You know, after all, Manly Hall gave me the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. I have to do this, right? I really went nuts. And I was like, you know, special diet and celibacy and all this stuff. I mean, just no TV in the house. You know, somehow that's very important to Rosicrucianism. I'm not sure why I thought so, but and so I got over it. Manly Hall thought it was hilarious too, and he later told me that he regretted that he had pushed so much of that kind of glamorized in the early days. He talked a lot about the initiates and the adepts and about, you know, how they were really running the world in a beneficial way and all that. He said, you know, I really wouldn't have pushed that so far. And he told me that he thought that he now thought that, you know, Rosicrucian was a good word for the people in each generation who are most dedicated to wisdom and to helping the human race.
Yes.
And that it didn't have to do with superpowers, that it had to do with dedication.
Nice.
Hi, Ronnie. Sorry, I'm going to jump in really quick. Sorry, Ronnie.
Sure.
No, go ahead.
I apologize for being late. I was really excited for you. Nick knows I have Rosicrucian fever. I think Lisa and Nick both do as well. So it's for funny, and Robby, obviously. But you made a great point on the kind of like the anti-fatalistic view of astrology, and also its transcendental nature. Like if you like, I'm fairly good at Kabbalah. I'll be humble today, but I'm fairly good. So for me, I can sort of understand other systems, but really use my system like Tantra. But I just code switch into Kabbalah if I need to sort of understand those ideas or more Western sort of view. And so for me, when I approach astrology, and I'm not an astrologer, but when I approach astrology, I approach it more through that sort of inner or secret meaning lens. So it's a lot more conceptual, as I'm sure you're well aware, and it's a lot more flexible. It's not dogmatic, it's not fixed. The relationships with the planets, they're like minor archons, but they're not, you know, they're not high up in the, you know, hierarchy of evil or anything. Like we can maneuver them. There are many techniques to do so, both metaphysical and non. So I just wanted to say that I think is a really interesting point to come all the way up.
Well, I'd like to say something about that actually, because I think that from my point of view, they represent a spectrum, and it's just a teaching function at the heart of this. So in other words, let's say that you're going through a difficult Saturn transit. And if you read about it, you know, in traditional mundane astrology, you're like, you're going to hide in your house and never come out when you read about Saturn transits. But the reality that I've experienced in my life of Saturn transits is it's about learning hard lessons. And if you learn those lessons well, Saturn rewards you. You don't get the worst of it. And if you've already learned those lessons, even negative Saturn aspects can bring wonderful accomplishments where you're recognized, you get some sort of boost in your work because people understand how much work you've done and how devoted you've been to it. And you get also this kind of understanding that there are certain things that are unique for each of us. So your Saturn lesson may be different from my Saturn lesson, but there are going to be lessons that can be understood through the lens of what Saturn represents. And the beauty to me of astrology is I can see that coming, and I can prepare myself in advance to say, wow, I've got a really major aspect coming up. So I want to really make sure that these areas of my life are shored up. And where am I weak here? You can address it in advance. And then Saturn comes along and maybe points out areas that you missed. But I have found that if you do it that way, if you're in collaboration with the universe, maybe going back to Manly Hall's The Rational Soul of the World, right? That it can be this, it's almost like a dance, because you do the right things and then the right things happen. So another example, Saturn, people think of Saturn and Capricorn people as being Saturnine and dark and materialistic, and they forget, Saturn is very funny, and Saturn people can be very funny. Saturn can be very sexy. I mean, the horny old goat, is a Saturn archetype. And I like to point to Elvis and say, that's a Capricorn, he's funny. He's somebody who loves to have a good time. He's very sexual, and Saturn has those elements. But there's a tendency to oversimplify in astrology, I think. So I agree with you completely that there's so many nuances, and it's so flexible.
Well, I love that you brought up Saturn. I call him Shawnee, but it's the same thing, obviously. But that's a great point, because I've tried to make that many times, where people will say, "Oh, Shawnee's like the Lord of Evil, the Lord of Death." No, he's the Lord of Karma, and he can be death by long life or by toil, as you said very well. Like he loves toil, he loves laborers. He is like the, if you want to call it, the saint of laborers. That's yeah.
Well, I'll give you another good example, since we mentioned Ficino. Saturn, this was a life changer for me when I figured it out, thanks to Ficino. He had an ascendant with Saturn right on it. And I happen to also have Saturn on my ascendant. And my partner Tamara has Saturn on her sun. And we've had this weird life. We've had a lot of luck, but the things that we've tried to do, like our band and our movies, and even to a degree, I guess, almost everything. When we try to get very worldly about it, right? Like, so now, how do we get this out there? How do we make this a success? How do we do what we're supposed to do? When you do these things, it always would fail spectacularly. And we can never understand it, because we've always had like the best people involved. Like in our music career, we had a great friendship with Danny Goldberg, who used to manage Nirvana, and he wanted to sign us repeatedly, but it never worked out. And we were always like, what is going on? Is it us? It must be us. And then one day I was going through some obscure Ficino work, and I found where he said, if you have Saturn on an angle or on your sun, anything you try to do in a worldly way will fail, because you must work on the matters of the gods. As long as you work on the matters of the gods, you will have incredible support. But the minute you start to concern yourself with what's going on in the common world, and your mind is filled with that, then your luck will fail. And this has been very true for us. Our areas of greatest success have been when we've been studying the soul, studying, the history of esotericism and such. And we have amazing luck when we do those things. We have a similar kind of luck when we do the music or the film, but it doesn't work that way. Like, we still attract great people, but it's like the world kind of just washes over it in a way, or fights occur and then things break up. But that doesn't happen when we work on this stuff. So I've kind of taken it to heart at this point, and I try to concentrate on those matters. But I think that's a good way to see, he apparently had found this from his own life, because whenever he tried to do what his dad wanted, to be a practical, successful man, Ficino would fail. But when he did what was really in his heart, he had the most amazing luck. Just this one story where he was beginning to translate the hymns of Orpheus, And he knew what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to spend his life translating Plato and the Hermetica and the Neoplatonists, but he didn't have the money. And his father was on his ass saying, listen, you're brilliant, get a job, do something. And so in frustration, as he was experiencing his first Saturn return, he did a hymn to the cosmos, asking to please, is there a way that, that I can do this work that's dear to my heart? And while he was doing the hymn to the cosmos, a letter arrived from Cosimo de' Medici telling him, I'm giving you a house, a village for your support. I want you to go there right now and spend the rest of your life translating Plato, the Hermetica, the Neoplatonists, and the hymns of Orpheus. And so that's what he did. And then because he did that, we got Paracelsus and Agrippa, and we got a Renaissance, the first in Florence, then in Italy, and then all through Europe. And this guy who failed at everything that he had attempted was suddenly the most influential, in some ways, man in Europe. And so this is what astrology kind of allows us to see these, how do we fit in the world? What are the potentials that we have? And what are the pitfalls that we may be facing?
That was great. Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Want to say something, Lisa?
Yes, I do. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to step over anybody else's toes. So some of the work that we've been doing with these individual mystics and occultists, and how we mentioned how it all looks like it's coming to a head during this time period that led up to the pamphlets being distributed among that part of Europe, which later became Rosicrucianism.
Yeah.
Is that it seemed like it was the evolution of spiritual science in this need for a spiritual science. And you hear a lot of the murmurings of Greek Kabbalah, Q. Mm-hmm. You hear Jewish Kabbalah, the K, and then Christian Kabbalah, the C, and how everybody's kind of wanting their own flair or flavor on it. And to me, it seemed like that Rosicrucianism was trying to bring it all together, as well as bring in science when it had been separated out.
Yeah.
So I would say that 20% of all authors tell the truth in their writing. And whether it was a joke, whether it was somewhat of a poking fun, I think it was this want and a litmus test for the consciousness and the culture that was happening at that point in time. Would you say that's kind of?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I mean, it really helps to establish the Western esoteric tradition as we know it, because these are always the same characters that are showing up. We're looking back to Egypt, right? And we're even after they figured out that the Hermetica was probably written down by the Neoplatonists, we still now believe that the ideas in the Hermetica are Egyptian. And then we come up into the Neoplatonists, and we from the Akkadians and from the Chaldeans, we're getting astrology coming out of Babylon, and that's coming into Greece, and then we get the Neoplatonists who sort of take Plato and his amazing summation of Egyptian and Greek metaphysics, and then they develop it into, in Proclus, it's kind of a science. And Pythagoras is highly valued by these people. So Michael Meyer considered himself a Pythagorean.
Yes, very much.
And so, and then, yes, definitely the Jewish Kabbalah is constantly being mixed into this. So Emperor Rudolph, for instance, would meet with the rabbi of Prague to talk about Kabbalah. And so there's this wonderful like melting pot kind of thing going on where they were saying, and this really, we owe a lot to Ficino and Pico here again, because this is the idea that, well, listen, the ancients had a lot to teach us. We shouldn't wipe everything out before the Old Testament, because there was great wisdom. So another book that I co-authored with Tamara, The Magic of the Orphic Hymns, is about the Orphic mysteries. And Orpheus was considered by the early Christians as a prototype of Jesus. And there were Christian fathers who said, we should be paying attention to the Orphic mysteries. There's wisdom here that helps us to understand our own Christian beliefs. And this kind of it reminds me of when a human being starts to integrate their early history, their family history, their cultural history. You know, it just broadens you so much when you get these greater perspectives instead of just your own personal point of view. And as it developed, it continues, you know, until you get it systematized by people like Blavatsky, who then try to suggest that this is an actual, you know, lineage of that starts in Egypt, and it's every step of the way it's being guided by these adepts. Now, is that true? We don't know. I mean, I always say I don't know if there is no such thing as invisible initiates. I don't know. I mean, I believe in the powers of the soul. I mean, who knows what is possible if we really achieve true understanding of our unobstructed self. But I find it hard to believe that there was this kind of a lineage. On the other hand, if I had met Manly Hall during, you know, medieval times, you guys wouldn't know about either one of us, probably, right? He would have taught me in secret. I would have taught somebody else. And these things don't make it into history often. So it's really very mysterious. But it seems like it's part of an awakening of European consciousness out of this sort of sleep that was imposed on it by the Dark Ages, the failure of the Roman Empire, the success of the Catholic Church, the suppression of diversity by these doctrines and by the confessional, right? And everything was heretic, you know, that's a heresy and that's a heresy, and heretics were killed.
Right.
And so I also want to point out the importance of Rosicrucianism in America for this very reason. Because when the 30 Years' War happened and when the Rosicrucian dream kind of failed in Europe and they realized, wow, we're not going to get rid of the Catholic Church, this is going to be a long battle, eyes started turning toward America. And in fact, Michael Meyer, who I just mentioned, was somebody who was an influence on the very first group of people who got together with Sir Walter Raleigh to start the first colonies in Virginia. And there were several Rosicrucian-oriented people in that first group, the treasurer, one of the secretaries. And so there were people with Rosicrucian ideas planning on America. And they saw America as a place where maybe they could have freedom of religion.
Right.
It's not an accident that it became written into our laws, this idea that it only appeared in Europe, in Prague. And so when America starts to happen, you get an influx of all different kinds of Rosicrucians. You get the pietists from Germany who like move to Pennsylvania and start Ephrata, or Woman in the Wilderness, and these kind of communes where they're going to practice their Rosicrucian, Jacob Boehme influenced ideas, and they're going to read the stars looking for the end of the world. And you also, however, you get people like the son of one of the great governors of Massachusetts Bay Colony, the governor who's talked about the shining city on a hill and all that. His son was deeply into Rosicrucianism, had gone in Europe looking for Rosicrucians, but didn't find anybody, and decided to live his life dedicated to Rosicrucian principles. And by the way, you know, pilgrims were not the way that we've been taught. I mean, this kid was practicing alchemy and astrology in his father's house in Boston. So the son of the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, the ultimate pilgrim, was an esotericist who was into the Kabbalah and astrology and Hermeticism. He was an alchemist. He became the doctor for the whole area, like this huge territory, because he came up with such good medicines, which he would give for free, which was a Rosicrucian dedication. Right. And he lived up to these ideals. He became one of the founding governors of Connecticut Territory and one of the first governors of Connecticut. So This is a guy who's absolutely dedicated to Rosicrucians. When he comes to America to join his father, he's got a couple barrels filled with John Dee's alchemical equipment, manuscripts, and books, right? And so he's trying to make the College of Light that Comenius wanted in what would become Connecticut. So this Rosicrucian influence comes to America to kind of try to create that dream of a country where it's free of this Catholic and this imperial domination. And I find it, whatever one's politics is, and I certainly don't want to go there, but I find it really ironic and interesting that right now we're in a very similar situation, because you've got a big push from the Catholic Church in America to control the society and the culture according to the lights of Catholicism. I mean, the Heritage Foundation is saturated in Catholicism.
Right.
And Vance is a Catholic. And some of these big tech bros are people who have been steeped in Catholicism.
Catholic Pope.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the new American Pope,
he's interesting. We'll see how he turns out. But I was glad that they chose him, and he seems to have a different view. He doesn't seem to want to dominate the world in the way that something like Opus does, right? Okay. Opus Dei. But we'll see. You never know with these guys. Yeah. But I like what he's doing. He seems to be trying to humanize. I like, for instance, that he's going to be doing this big mass for young people on the same day that there's going to be the military parade for the celebration of the president's birthday. I mean, he's certainly sending a message there. And I think we also have an imperial presidency, in a sense, something that is recognizable as almost Habsburg-like. It's all power accrues to one leader, and you all do what we say, and there's this huge bureaucracy, and there's nowhere to appeal. I mean, Kafka, his writing was capturing the end of the Habsburg bureaucracy and how horrendous it was. I mean, you never knew what was going on. And when I read stories about people who are just taken away and then nobody knows what happened or where they are, and it reminds me a lot of Kafka and also of the Habsburg imperialism. So it's interesting that America right now is having this kind of moment, which is appropriate since this is the American Pluto return, and we soon will be in the US Uranus return. This country is facing its shadows and the consequences of its beliefs and actions, and it's all kind of coming to this ugly head, and no one knows whether this is going to be a cure, or like with alchemy, it's like, is it just curing you or is it killing you? We're not sure yet.
Right.
But that's kind of how I see it. But it's interesting to me that this same element seems to be happening, this desire by the Catholic Church to exert control over women and over the culture. And the funny thing is, the Rosicrucians, they were kind of pro-female. There were even books written by female Rosicrucians back in those days, and there was supposedly a female sisterhood of Rosicrucians, and there was a respect for the divine feminine in that work, and like we see in The Chemical Wedding, where CRC is guided by a female, so it's this kind of split personality that America also has inherited from its European ancestry.
Something I wanted to bring up, I want to go back a little bit. You happen to mention Jacob, and I'm actually working on a kind of like a thing on him right now.
Oh, cool.
And, to me, I was a little, not that I haven't heard it before, him mentioned, and again, I haven't listened to so many people that have either covered him or Rosicrucianism, but I haven't really heard anybody kind of mention him together with Rosicrucianism. And there was a part in the show when I did it, I was saying that he never claimed to be one, but this is I kind of want to lead into, I think this might kind of help maybe with the theory that I have with who Rosicrucians actually were. And it kind of goes along with the whole thing, like maybe like you'll know one when you see one. I with his experience and the stuff that he writes about, seems very close or kind of aligned with Rosicrucianism. So I do wonder, like in some way, like, will people have an experience due to studying and practicing this stuff that will change the way they look at everything, that when they see somebody else writing about it, they're like, I understand that person because they're talking my style, since I've had this experience and looked at things differently. I think that's kind of like why, for me, a lot of these people that I happen to cover that I realize are Rosicrucians, a lot of the stuff in their older books is very like hits me very hard, or I'll realize things that I have said that I theorized about with my magical experiences. I'm realizing there was years ago, and I'm like, so I do wonder, is it just because you have a shared experience that you can both understand what each other is saying? And that's kind of like the group.
I think so. I mean, this, in a way, this pertains to the whole world, right? Because, I mean, to me, and this is very controversial. I know there are a lot of people who feel that you should not conflate the spiritual aspects of, say, the secret of the golden flower with what the Rosicrucians are after. But my viewpoint, it's just my viewpoint, I'm not trying to convince anybody, is that it's like anatomy or biology. I mean, we're all human beings, and therefore we have a certain way of experiencing the spiritual side of life. And it should be something you can recognize. Now, Manly Hall taught that at the center of all religions, you'll find the same truth.
Yes. I think so.
And so I feel now that I've studied as long as I have, I'm constantly recognizing it in different metaphors. It's in the Bible. It talks about it blatantly. It's in Walt Whitman's poetry. It's in the Bhagavad Gita. It's been written about in every way it could be written about. The metaphors are all different because that's kind of an accident of time and place. But when you get down into the nitty gritty of what's being presented, you suddenly find it's these same ideas over and over again about what the spiritual experiences is, what it leads to, and how you get there. And so now, particularly in the hotbed of German Protestantism, we know that guys like Jacob are picking up from Paracelsus, and they're picking up from Ficino, and sometimes through secondary sources, other books that were inspired by a writer like Ficino, but may have been obscure. And so this awakens the spiritual side, and these experiences begin to happen that you recognize, as you said, in the writing of other people. And I think that now that this is the big question, because the Theosophical Rosicrucian societies have gone, I would think, kind of way overboard with, Lincoln was a Rosicrucian, and Akhenaten was a Rosicrucian, even though Rosicrucianism wouldn't be invented for 2,000 years. And now I get that, in a metaphorical way. Well, yeah, sort of. They sort of are Rosicrucians. And maybe that's in the way that Manly Hall said. It represents a certain type of person who's trying to bring light into the world and trying to help the world be a better place and help people find their souls. And yet, at the same time, it begins to glamorize it. And you begin to think, wow, everybody who's ever been interested in these subjects is a Rosicrucian, or I can say that that's a Rosicrucian. On the other hand, you can't throw it out either completely, because you mentioned Francis Bacon at the very beginning of this conversation. And Manly Hall was one of those people who thought that Bacon was involved in the creation of the Shakespeare plays, and that Bacon was a major player in Rosicrucianism and in the foundation of America. And now most research, when you look at Bacon's life, part of my reaction is when, like his own life was like so busy that when did he have time to do all those other things?
He was in exile.
Right. And then people even said that he was Andre.
Yeah.
And that's really a fancy trick.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you find these weird things, like one that Manly Hall showed me once, which was in The Anatomy of Melancholy by Burton, which had a footnote in it that referred to Francis Rosicrucian. And there was another footnote like that referred to Andre Lord Verulam. And these are from ancient, not ancient, but books from the 1600s, right? And what is that? Is it a typo? Is it somebody saying, hey, Francis Bacon was deeply involved in this stuff? No wonder people suspect that there's a connection between Andre and Francis Bacon, because the only Lord Verulam at that time was Francis Bacon. Certainly not Andre. So those kind of questions, part of to me, the exciting aspect of Rosicrucianism is these almost Zen koan-like mysteries
Right.
that defeat reason, and you can't really settle down on this is how it is. Now, especially Jacob, has been claimed as a Rosicrucian, and there were Rosicrucian pietist groups, like the group that did the secret symbols of the Rosicrucians in Pennsylvania, who they believed that the Rosicrucians and Jacob were teaching the same basic things, and they were illuminating each other's work. So that is, is he a Rosicrucian? Was he around Rosicrucians? Here's a fact that makes you wonder. When Frederick and Elizabeth came to Prague, guess who was in the audience? Jacob. So he traveled all the way to Prague to see the supposed new Rosicrucian Hermetic Emperor arrive when all the Rosicrucian flurry was going on. Andre was there too. Who knows who talked to who?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even know that. That's interesting.
That's definitely a plot twist.
Yeah. I might have to throw that in the show. I'm not done with it. I'll quote you. Thank you.
Okay.
Like, thanks to Ronnie, I could throw this tidbit in here. Right. Wow. Another thing I did want to bring up, again, is just another idea of mine that I had wondered about, like even, I guess, the rise or come to be of Rosicrucianism, is that, and you mentioned Ficino and Pico.
Yeah.
I think at that time, from the stuff that I've noticed researching a lot, this subject or those people a lot recently, is that once they started to be able to toss in like the Kabbalah and Hermeticism, they're like, oh my God, we're making breakthroughs in understanding the Bible and God and ourselves, and in positive ways, not so you can manipulate and be whatever. They're actually trying to understand themselves, God, and the world we're in. And I feel like at some point they started saying, nope, we can't do that anymore. And you're like, really? Like, well, no, like that's not cool. Like, and people still wanted to pump out that type of ideas that was allowed to at some point to be looked at.
Well, once the 30 Years' War hit, the strictness on both sides, and everybody got hit by it. I mean, Andre's home was destroyed, and people had to flee into the woods to wait until the Imperial Army left, and it turned everything upside down. And so not too long later, I mean, maybe one generation later, Rosicrucian is a word for an idiot, for like a superstitious old man who has no idea what's really going on in the world. It becomes a comedic term and a comedic character in English drama. So it becomes so discredited. I mean, it's funny because when John Winthrop Jr., the Rosicrucian from Connecticut, got into the Rosicrucians, was at a time when they were a joke. But he saw past it, and he was like, no, this stuff's real. But he went to meet people that he was told were Rosicrucians, and he came out of all those meetings going, no, that's not it. So this is it definitely was a kind of a retraction, or like the tide coming out, right? And this did create a kind of suppression on these works. There's also panics. I mean, at one point in Paris, for example, some smartass, I think it was probably a hoax, put up posters all over Paris saying, the Rosicrucians have arrived. We're here to find new members. You don't have to try to find us. We'll find you.
We'll find you.
Yeah.
And people freaked. Like, I mean, the big newspapers, Rosicrucian demons amongst our midst. And they found some guy who was a painter, really a masterpiece type of painter. But he was notoriously obscene and foul-mouthed, and he claimed to be a Rosicrucian. And they convened like these experts to interview him, and they said, yes, we believe he is a Rosicrucian, but he's proof that the Rosicrucians are foul and evil because he's the most cantankerous, awful person. So those kind of panics spread, and it really suppressed the feelings about it. And I think another thing that kind of made it worse was in the 17th century, as things begin to develop, you see the beginnings of like Freemasonry begins to strongly and become involved in Rosicrucian ideas, and you get a Rosicrucian degree, for example, in the Scottish Rite,
right?
Or you get the SRIA, right, which is a bunch of Masons in England who create a Rosicrucian society, and they meet and they try to study this stuff, and people get initiated by them and then say, well, I'm an initiated Rosicrucian. Well, you're an initiated Rosicrucian into this order that some guy made up,
right.
But that's not what people think when you say that.
Yeah.
And then you get situations like Paschal Beverly Randolph, who, he claimed that he had been taught by Rosicrucians in Europe, and he released a book that was all filled with this Rosicrucian wisdom, supposedly very kind of theosophical stuff. A lot of it is own channeled material. And later admitted that he only did it because, as a man of color, when he would talk about his ideas, he was ignored. But as soon as he said that he got them from the Rosicrucians, everybody paid attention. And he admitted, but I never met a Rosicrucian, really. So that is a constant trouble for scholars who are trying to get into this stuff. I'll give you another example of this. Something you might find interesting, since you did such a wonderful piece on Flood.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
So Flood, a lot of people talk about Flood and Meyer being friends, that Meyer was Flood's agent when he got his books published by DeBry, and that they were actually two Rosicrucians working together. And if you look at the famous novel that's all about this stuff, Flood is considered a member of the great secret order, right? And in his unpublished book, A Philosophical Key, unpublished during his life, there were just a few copies published after he died, and most of them were just left in obscurity until very recently. Flood includes in A Philosophical Key an oath that he has signed saying that he is not a member of the Rosicrucian order. Now we're left to wonder, is he protecting himself? Is he, we still don't know exactly why he did that. Meyer also said in one of his books, I am not a Rosicrucian. But people say, but he wrote a book called, The Laws of the Rosy Cross. Mm-hmm. Well, that was his meditation on what these laws meant. And if you follow them through, where would this take you? And then when people say, well, these were a couple of initiates who were close friends, a letter has been found from Meyer to Moritz the Learned, where he says some very uninitiate things about Flood. He's really pissed at him because he says that somewhere Flood had written that Germans are idle, negligent, and slow, and that the English are good-hearted, audacious, and they're courageous. And Flood was like typical attitude of the English toward the Germans at that time. But Meyer got angry and wrote Moritz and said, no, the Germans are in command. We're the ones who really keep the empire going, and I'm going to deliver this man a written whipping unless you tell me not to, because he's very insolent. Man, that's not Rosicrucian initiate talk. That's a couple of writers who are interested in the same subjects and have a lot in common, but apparently their racial or, let's say, national derivations are at odds. And so there's so much mystery in these relationships. And it even doesn't mean, he may have said that and still, outside of any historical record, have had some kind of contact with Flood that we can't prove. Flood is also interesting. I think this is worth pointing out about the Rosicrucians, because at near the end of his career, Flood gets into this pamphlet war with a guy who says that they had this really weird curing method back in those days, where they would, if you couldn't get to the person who was wounded, you would take the sword that wounded him and you would put this special stuff on the sword. And the sword was said to heal this wound. And this was because the blood was still connected in some weird astral way to the person, even if the sword was far away. And this was a very popular cure. And one day, this parson, an unknown person, nailed onto Flood's door this denunciation that this cure was the devil's work. And there's no sign of it in the Bible. So Flood starts a pamphlet war with this guy, and he's saying, nonsense, this is for real. And this attracts the attention of a doctor who writes an absolutely devastating attack on the whole concept and just says, look, this is the most ridiculous thing ever. So if the guy gets wounded by 3 different swords, you got to find all 3 swords. Why doesn't the balm work on the wound if it's so good? And, my guess is that, half the people get better and half of them die, because that's just how nature works. And, you guys are thinking it's this magic trick. And then even more devastating, and this is my point, he gets into it with Mersenne, right? And I think of Mersenne as a tragic character. He's a very early kind of scientific materialist, but he's a Jesuit. He's a Catholic. And so he looks at Flood's ideas about music and about how we hear, and he's just like, oh, nonsense. What a bunch of, tripe this is. I mean, we hear because we have a little bone in the ear, like he figured that out. And it's about vibrations, and they start to fight each other. And the funny thing about it is that both of them are very metaphysically soul-oriented people. They just disagree with how one is looking at it. But in their argument, you find the end of the Renaissance and the beginning of scientific materialism, because both of them become kind of something to react against for the next generation who want to be scientists. So it's ironic because Flood, who was a big help to the beginning of science with the circulation of blood and other ideas that he helped to originate with his friends, and Mersenne, who, was a Jesuit. I mean, he was, he worshiped Jesus. They actually became Flood because it was considered nonsense, and Mersenne because, he's right, but he didn't take it far enough. Big influences on what we have today, which is this kind of scientific materialism where so much wisdom is lost because it doesn't fit into these narrow parameters of a certain method that's useful for certain things, but doesn't apply to every aspect of life.
Did anybody have any questions or anything?
Yeah, so now when you look at the traditional rise of Rosicrucianism and kind of all the philosophical elements of the ancient world that were kind of incorporated from the alchemical to the metaphysical, and then you kind of bring that into more modern times, and you go through the 60s and the 70s, and in the back of the sci-fi rags you see, join the Rosicrucians, get the secrets of the universe. And we have this Rosicrucian society, I believe it's in Cincinnati, that's the oldest established one in the United States. And they'll sell you the various lectures that they have in regard to self-improvement and into like the Georgia Guidestones that were signed by like Christian Rosicrucian, with the CRC. Like in comparison to the origins of Rosicrucianism, in bringing that into the modern world, how much would you say those two ideas are either attached or disassociated?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. Waite used to say that they have no connection at all, that the new orders are just inventions and have nothing to do with it. But I think that's oversimplifying it. I think that there are a lot of Rosicrucian ideas in these orders. For instance, the one in California practices free healing sessions through meditation and kind of sort of magical forms of healing, and I do think that they are correctly called Theosophical Rosicrucianism orders, because so much of this has a theosophical bent. You'll see them going into root races and going into these lineages of adepts and things that were definitely foreign. I think that's kind of a natural progression that happens, because you start with something that is this as I said earlier, it's almost like students who get all worked up, and they're high on Giordano Bruno, and they're like,
right.
and they're writing this radical literature. They're daring to say, we'll scratch the Pope to death with nails. Probably the nails that Jesus was hammered to the cross with. It's probably metaphorical, but nevertheless, they're saying that, and it's revolutionary, and it causes this big ruckus, and people are angry, and there's riots in Paris, and but then later, it turns into something that is much different. It's somebody trying to make a living at it, and trying to be a school and to teach people the basics of metaphysics and help them to do what they want to accomplish, which is to become acquainted with their own souls, and to do it in a way that fits into the modern world, at that time, the modern world. And so I do think that they're connected. The spirit of it is somewhat different. I mean, I think if you had gone to hang out with Andre and his friends, they would have been, drinking German beer, and they would have been excitedly talking. If they had had weed, they would have been smoking it, but they didn't have it. If you go to these, and I have, to these Rosicrucian orders, they're lovely. I mean, they remind me a lot of the Theosophical Society. They do good things for the community. They have books that people can borrow and read. They have access to lectures that help explain ideas. It's not a bad place to start, not unlike the Philosophical Research Society. What I liked about PRS in particular, and what I like about PRS, is that it lacks a denomination. It's everything, right? That's one of the things that just was wonderful about Manly Hall, is that he had a great love of culture, of all culture, art, and I mean, he appreciated the little things in culture, and so that kind of becomes a love of life, because you're constantly being surprised by the wonders of creation and creativity, human and natural. And so, but I do think that the Rosicrucian societies also do this to a degree. And I should mention that Max Heindel's order in California was very important to Manly Hall in the early days, because after Max passed, his wife was one of Manly Hall's serious mentors. She taught him a lot about astrology. She encouraged him to lecture. She even taught him how to bind books and how to be a book publisher. PRS used to publish their own books. Cool. So there was this Rosicrucian influence directly from that order that Max Heindel founded on Manly Hall and on what he did.
Nice.
That's very interesting. I would say, I'm going to insert real quick. And please correct me if I'm wrong. I would say that there was also an influence of the Holy Grail belief system that existed in the 9th century, I believe, in that when you look at the Holy Grail, well, they did, I guess my interpretation of it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it wasn't about bloodlines per se. It was about you yourself, your body was the Grail, and you were trying the highest holy level, and which I think kind of builds upon Gnostic or Gnosticism. When you look at some of the teachings of Mary Magdalene, how you yourself is what's supposed to ascend and try to become the better version of yourself. So I don't know, it seems like there was some of that incorporation into some of the
absolutely
stuff that we would read.
Absolutely. I would mention that Rudolph II, since we've been talking about him, he thought that he owned the Holy Grail, which at that time was like this little shallow agate bowl. And he used to use it when he was terrified that he was being attacked magically by the Pope or being prayed against by the priests. He would drink a little holy water from this what he thought was the Holy Grail to purify himself, to protect himself from this negative influence. I think that it goes back, I agree with you, and I think that it goes back to the Neoplatonists at least, but through them to the Egyptians, because this is this Egyptian idea of ensouling statues, which was then applied philosophically to ensouling a human being. So the ancient Egyptians would bring together all the things that were necessary for a certain god, the symbols, the substances and such. And these things would be smeared on the stone as it was being carved, and it was this whole process of every step of the way that this statue was being made. It had to be worthy of being ensouled by the gods, and so I might add, by the way, really interesting. I've done some research on the resurgence of the ancient Egyptian goddess Sekhmet. And there are statues in the museums and also in Egypt that people are constantly reporting on TikTok and other places that they move, or that they had a spontaneous healing in front of the statue, or that they saw the statue's eyes open, or I mean, all kinds of weird things are happening today to people who had no idea who Sekhmet was or that the Egyptians did this stuff. So maybe that's the result of this process of ensoulment. I don't know. But philosophers, especially the Neoplatonists, came along and they started to say, well, this is the model for human spiritual development. And we see this especially with the Iamblichus and this kind of, you know, I'm going to make myself the vessel for the divine. I'm going to do the right things at the right time, bring the right things together, and have the right approach so that I can earn divine grace. And that divine grace can be an experience of enlightenment, of cosmic consciousness, if you want to call it that. But it can also be seeing the future. So if you did divination, if you're doing tarot, or you're doing even something like I Ching, the idea is that you're getting the vision of the gods. Like, they're sharing that with you. And it's your own in a way, because you're a child of the gods, and within you, you have this divine self that needs to be purified over time and brought out. But now, as a human being in an obstructed body, and you want to know, gee, should I do this or should I do that? And you put yourself into a space, you do a meditation or a prayer, and then you pick up your oracular instrument. And if you get a good reading, the ancients believe that's because the gods smiled on you. The gods said, here, have some of my vision. I can see the future. I can see the past that has caused this situation. And that's why, according to them, astrology and all the other forms of omenry work, because they are the divine vision, and they enable us to raise ourselves to awaken a little bit of our own divine vision, so that we can have that kind of wider perspective. And so you become the Holy Grail, or the holy statue is your body. It's you yourself. You can even say your soul, as you're awakening this divine essence that is you. And so I do think that is what you can see happening in these Rosicrucian orders, so the Rosicrucian pietists and such. These are people who are lots of prayer and meditation to purify. They're purifying themselves through diet, like the ancient Orphics did. And they're doing this so that they can commune with the divine. And this is really the difference between these two orders of religious experience. You know, on the one side, you have established religions, whether it was the Olympian religion in ancient Greece or the Catholic Church today. And on the other side, you have, I want a direct revelation. I don't want what yesterday had. I don't want a priest to tell me what to do. I want to talk to God. Heresy, you know, and a big threat to the world, because when you get God on your side, you know, people do all kinds of stuff when they think that they're doing that for God and they've got God at their back. And so this is, I think, the essence of it. I have no doubt that that's how Manly Hall saw it. I mean, he was somebody who was trying to bring that awareness into the world and trying to live a life that would do that as much as possible, to leave as many artifacts as he could that would have that power to awaken in the way that his book awakened me.
I think that also plays a great deal into the idea of the sacred temple builders and modeling the temples after the body, in regards symbolically that the body itself is the grail or the temple to be purified.
Oh, absolutely. Masonry is way into that. Yeah, yes, that's definitely. I mean, all the symbolism of masonry is about your own life and about
square in the stone. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
I have a couple. I'll keep it really quick. I'm sorry, Nick. Just let me.
No, not at all.
A couple. But I think Ronnie will find them all interesting. And so Lisa said a really interesting point. I think Lisa knows this. I'm very interested in this idea of like some people have called it the Aeon of the Daughter, this Mary Magdalene, the Grail, quote unquote. But it is, as Lisa said, it is yourself. It's really that it's you to create a vessel that's worthy of like higher consciousness. So I personally believe that, and so I just want to say that. So that was a great point, Lisa. And she also said something interesting about like or to maybe play into the idea of stages of consciousness. You mentioned Sekhmet. So a lot of Indian scholars believe that there's a direct equivalent still extant, still worshipped in India. And so there are three names: Naram Simhi, who is the normative, we'll say orthodox sort of Vaishnava goddess. Then you have Pratanya Gira, who is the heterodox, very tantric goddess. And then you have the Buddhist version, Sangdong Ma. So you could say that all three of those represent it's not like it's the same ontological goddess, but you could say that they are three different positionalities of her consciousness. So I don't know if you think that's interesting.
I think that's true. And I think you can also see, with Sekhmet, you look over at Durga, right? So similar. Sekhmet is a justice goddess. She's the one who's preserving Ma'at, the what makes life possible, the order of the universe. And so Durga is a justice goddess. Durga is riding on a tiger. Sekhmet is lion-headed. I mean, there's
that's the same as the Pratanya Gira. She has a lion's face.
Exactly. And the question becomes, now, is this direct influence, or did these spontaneously arise apart from each other? And that's something that no one is sure of, because we don't really have much evidence. The whole Sekhmet story, especially interesting because this is a goddess who was forgotten. I mean, just forgotten. I mean, the British Museum, they kept her statues under blankets in the basement because she had her boobs out, It was just radical. And they don't even, she's gone. The only time you'll see her at all is once in a while you'll see her in like a weird silent movie or something. Some set designer dug her up from a book by Budge, and they made a Sekhmet statue. You might have seen her in one of the couple of museums that showed the statue. No information was out there. And starting, I think in the 70s, she starts to kind of pop up more. There's an academic book about all the names that she had, because she had all these names. One of them was She Before Whom All the Gods Tremble. And then you got Robert Masters wrote this book about her. And this is like in 1980 something. And that book became very popular and kind of revived the worship. There's now a Sekhmet priesthood. There's two different lineages that are conferring that priesthood. There's a Sekhmet temple. There are, if you go to TikTok, there's tons of things about Sekhmet. If you go to eBay, there's tons of things you can buy with Sekhmet on it. Sekhmet, I had weird experiences because when I was first drawn to Sekhmet, I was one of those people who dreamed about her, like heard the name before I'd ever run into her, as far as I knew. And I was like, what in the world is that? I knew it had something to do with a lion and that it was Sekhmet. And at that time, I was working at PRS and I was going through all the library. I couldn't find anything. I mean, it was really difficult to find anything on her. There was a little bit by Budge, and that was about it. And I was stunned when I walked into a bookstore and saw a book on her there by Masters. And then when I was touring, what was really weird was that I was in a Riot Girl band, a punk band, and a lot of the women and even some of the men that I ran into had Sekhmet tattoos. And if you said, I go, well, you got Sekhmet on your arm. They'd be like, Sekhmet? And we'd have this like conversation. I'd be like, wow, that's weird. And then when I started to publicly talk about it, I started hearing from all kinds of people, many of whom had the same experience of Sekhmet came to me in a dream. I didn't know who she was. Or somebody who, I know one person we interviewed who she saw a Sekhmet statue in a museum and fell on her knees and started weeping, and she didn't know why. And she felt like she found herself and became a worshiper of Sekhmet, a priestess. And it's just been growing and growing. And I think it's partly because this represents feminine power. And of all the goddesses out there, I mean, she's considered, I mean, her name kind of means invincible, right? So she's such a symbol of power that I think she's very appealing to women who are seeking to change the way that society has marginalized women. But what is Sekhmet is a good question. I mean, what are these Hindu goddesses? Are we dealing with aliens? Are we dealing with spiritual entities? Are we dealing with demons masquerading as gods, as the Catholics would have us believe?
Well, this is a great question, Ronnie. Sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
think I have an answer for you, because
Yes.
obviously I'm Buddhist, so Buddhism provides the answer, but I'll be the vehicle for it. Is that we would just say it's dakinis or existence appearance. So it could be either of those two things. So something of your mind that appears in a specific way that is relational to your consciousness, or it's something independently arising, self-arising, which is a dakini. So like they're kind of like a Scarlet Woman or a Sky Dancer or like a Yogini.
Yeah.
That's like the Yogini temples in India. That's what,
Yeah.
and Naram Simha is actually a Yogini. She is part of the 64 grouping, and a very important one in the Southern Indian Srivijaya tradition. And she has a lion's face. So that's why I think it's so interesting, because we would say that like the dakinis are around us all the time, kind of like angels, I guess, but like maybe a more non-dual kind of angel, because they're supposedly fully non-dual. They live in a fully non-dual consciousness. So when they appear before people, they're kind of relaying their inner and secret meanings through their appearance, like to people. So for us, she represents you mentioned justice. That's a really good word for it. She destroys all the black magic in the worlds, but she also, it can be said to be like the negative space, the negative sound of black magic being recited. So she both arises from the word, but it's not really from the word. It's in the little spaces between, but she also destroys that same kind of aggregation, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. It reminds me very much of the Vajrakalaya method, the summoning of the demons and the conversion of them into guardians.
Oh yeah, so they don't know that about. I've never discussed this. Maybe someone else has discussed this on the show. It's interesting that you bring this up, because I usually don't talk about that practice, but that's really interesting, Ronnie.
The Red Amulet. I mean, I don't know if you've read that, but wow.
Yes, one of my favorite books. The Dark
Isn't it wonderful?
Amulet,
yeah,
a wonderful book. Yes,
awesome. Yeah, and so Sekhmet without being Sekhmet, right?
Well, it's interesting because Guru Padmasambhava, his personal dakini was the Buddhist version of Sekhmet, we'll call her, the lion-faced dakini, and he was a master of dual-wielding kilas. So he held a kila in both hands. So that's why it's so important, like kila and the Sekhmet sort of personage, they kind of go together in a way.
Yes. Well, there you have Sekhmet, and you can do different ways. You can have Sekhmet and Ptah, right, as a couple, where he's this incredibly creative and beneficial. He's doing all the building up, and she's doing the tearing down. She's doing the ending of things. And you've also got the Sekhmet Bast duality, right, where Sekhmet is this fierce justice goddess, and Bast was that too. But in the later years in Egypt, Bast became sort of more of the domestic goddess, and represented the softer side. There's these wonderful. There's like a witch story that goes around that Sekhmet. There's a famous story about how Sekhmet was fooled into attacking humanity. She was made drunk in order to stop her, because she wouldn't stop, because she couldn't find any human being that deserved to live. And then she was angry at the gods because they had cheated her. They had tricked her into doing this thing, and she was acting out on behalf of Ra, and then Ra's telling her, "Hey, stop acting out. What are you doing? You're out of control." This is such a picture of toxic fatherhood, and traumatized daughter. But in this myth, the witches say that then she was very upset by this, and she said to Hermes, to Thoth, "I will have my revenge, because when all of you are forgotten, I will still be worshipped." And Thoth said, "Well, how are you going to do that if we're all forgotten?" And so she turned herself into every domestic cat that has ever existed. I think that's cute. I like that story.
Yeah.
Everybody has a little Sekhmet in their house if you want a cat.
I like that. You know what's interesting? I've heard that same story, but as related to Hathor.
Really?
Right.
Well, that's actually, it is Hathor. Hathor transforms into Sekhmet in this version of the story.
Oh yes, wow, yeah.
Now I'm right about that story. You know, that's in the Book of the Cow, and but that book was written at a very sophisticated time in Egyptian history. It reminds me of the Golden Ass of Apuleius in a way. I'm not sure that it's meant to be taken literally as it is. I think there's a satirical quality to the way it portrays the gods. And I don't know if this was really part of the depth of Sekhmet belief, because right now it's considered such an important story, you know, her bloodthirsty attack on humanity. But it really only exists in this one tradition, which is rather late in comparison to the early Sekhmet stories. And the earliest versions out of Memphis, she's part of a trinity with Ptah as the creator god, and she's the divine feminine, and then their son is this Nefertem, is this god of healing and of intoxication and of beauty. And it's a really kind of wholesome trinity compared to the Catholic one, which is, you know, a fierce, dominating father and a ghost who may be feminine, I don't know.
Right.
And then the son who's got to be murdered. You know, here we had this fierce, powerful female protecting the natural order, this wonderfully creative male god who's making things to make her happy, you know, and then their son who represents the beauty and intoxication of life and healing. Man, Memphis must have been nice. That's what, when I hear about that, I think that must have been nice.
All right. Listen, I mean, I'm sure we could keep going for hours, but hours, that's longer than I normally get out of a Northwest. So thank you very much.
That was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I really do. I really do appreciate you. I mean, you spent about 30 minutes or 35 minutes, you know, telling your story with Manly P. Hall. I do appreciate you doing that. I think it was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Your experience. I mean, it's great.
I want people to know he was really a great human being. Just everybody, he was like the greatest grandfather you could hope for. I didn't have any grandparents because they were killed in the war. Well, I had one. She was practically not there though. She was mentally destroyed. But he was like my grandfather. He was like the ultimate grandfather. Just everybody should have a Manly Hall grandfather.
Well, thank you again for even that tale and for you know the Rosicrucian talk. This was amazing. Thank you so much. Definitely love to have you back on again. You know?
Sure, anytime. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for the excellent questions, everybody. It was really enjoyable.
Yeah, this was great. Would you like to let everybody know where they can get in contact with you if they'd like to either have you on their show or buy your books?
Sure. My books are available pretty much anywhere. I encourage people to buy them from independent bookstores where you can order them if they don't have it, or from Inner Traditions, the publisher of all of them except the Unobstructed Way, which isn't out yet. And you can find me on all the platforms. I mean, usually Instagram is probably where I'm going to respond quickest. I'm on YouTube with a channel, so you can see interviews. I've done a series of videos on the Unobstructed Universe teaching. So if you're interested in that and you don't want to wait for the book, you can check it out there. And my videos are generally, I try to tell stories that have life-changing potential, that are really inspiring. So you'll also run into a more in-depth look at John Winthrop in a video called The Pagan Hermes. And there's another one called The Pagan Pilgrim about somebody we didn't get a chance to talk about. Tom Morton is quite a character. And get in touch. I'm happy to answer questions, and you can check out my documentary work and my music from my YouTube page, because there are playlists for the teasers for the documentaries, and there's some playlists of my contributions to the band that I'm in, Lucid Nation. And say hi.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Ronnie. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for doing this, by the way. I think it's great what you guys are doing. I love your whole process.
Thank you. Real quick, since Jin, you missed the beginning, would you like to let everybody know where they can find all your work as well?
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you to Ronnie and obviously Lisa and Robbie. But this was a great show. I was actually looking forward to this. Like as soon as I got the invite, like exactly my kind of subject matter. So thank you so much for making a very interesting 2 hours, Ronnie. I appreciate it so much.
Oh, thank you.
So if people want to find me, they can follow me on Twitter at Wukong Reborn, WUKONG Reborn, or the show account at Threshold Saints and on IG also. And the link, my link tree will be in the show notes as they always are. So thank you guys so much. Appreciate that.
Thank you for always doing it. Everybody's links are in the bottom. So yeah, check that out. And I also wanted to thank everybody in the chat. We had a bunch of people in here and it was kind of spur of the moment and there was a lot of great stuff in there. That's why I go live. I appreciate you all. And again, that's it. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.
Good weekend, everybody.